If you're a crafty girl like myself, I am sure that you have been personally victimized by a tech bro at some point in your life. I went to a predominantly business and engineering school, and non-stop my first year, the people that would make fun of my major the most were the tech bros and the engineers. They loved to tell me that I wouldn't get a job one day, that my major wasn't real, but 8 years later, none of us have jobs, everyone got laid off, we're in a recession, you might as well follow your dreams. But seriously, when you look at the tech bro and the crafty girl, they seem like the most polar opposite of people. You've got the hoodie wearing guy in Silicon Valley, surrounded by glowing screens, talking about Bitcoin and having debates about venture capital. Then you have the crafty girl sitting in her cozy living room, surrounded by candles, watching Pride and Prejudice, with a bunch of cats around her, a basket of half-finished projects as she knits her fourth Sophie scarf. While the crafty girl and the tech bro seem like they couldn't be further apart, they're actually a lot more similar than you think. What if I told you that the computer did not begin made of machine and metal, but of thread, but of fabric? Because the truth is, the computer began with craft, with looms operated primarily by women, with patterns handed down through generations, and with a binary logic woven into textiles long before it was etched into silicon. Today I'll be doing a deep dive tracing these origins in weaving to show that it didn't just influence computing, it literally provided the blueprint. Hi, my name is Meryl, and welcome to the first episode of RHIZOMATIC, your favorite virtual third space on the internet discussing the intersection of textiles and technology and everything that grows in between. Before diving too deep into the history, we need to discuss a little bit about how weaving works, because it's a lot more complex than you think. If you're familiar with textiles at all, you'll probably know that there's two types of structures when it comes to the creation of fabric. There's knitting, which is a series of loops, and these loops give you the ability to have some stretch. And then weaving operates more on a grid, with the warp running vertically and the weft running horizontally to make a more stable fabric. Now, if you've ever done the elementary school craft where you weave strips of paper over and under each other, you're actually learning how to weave. The earliest looms pretty much used that same over-under concept, and they were called tapestry looms, where weavers would pass the weft, which is the horizontal string, over and under manually through the warp thread by thread. Despite this long and laborious process, some of our most intricate and beautiful tapestries were made using this concept, like the unicorn tapestry and the apocalypse tapestry. Now, while weavers were able to get this incredible detail in these scenes, it was very slow. So in order to combat this, they invented the harness loom. The way that harness looms work is that they would attach a series of threads onto these frames that were then connected to pedals. And when you clicked the pedals, these frames would raise. And you could thread the warp into a sequence of patterns so that every time you hit a pedal, you would be able to weave it in a different pattern. Now, this was very satisfying for a while because it sped up the process of weaving. However, you were not able to get that detail that was previously seen in tapestry weaving. Despite these looms not being the perfect solution to what we were looking for, it did provide us with a really important insight. Weaving is built on a binary structure. Each warp is either up or down. Each interlace is either over or under. The entire system runs on yes and no decisions. Long before computers existed, weaving relied on a binary logic. The first binary language ran not on zeros and ones, but on warp and weft. Ali Jones does a great job describing this in the following clip.
But in a loom like this, you can basically draw out a plan for how you're going to make a fabric. And this is kind of like source code for a fabric called a draft. In the center of the draft, you have a grid, and that represents each square is an intersection of a warp and a weft thread. So the horizontal rows are one pass of the weft, and each vertical row is a warp. The parts that are red in this drawing are where weft fabric is on top, and the white parts are where warp, or I got that backwards. Weft is on top if it's red, white is on top if it's weft. And if you look at this, you can see that a woven fabric is in a way representable as binary, because basically all you need to know is the warp on top here, or is it underneath the weft? So the top part of this diagram is telling you which harnesses each warp thread should be connected to. So each horizontal row is a harness. The top left part is how you connect the harnesses to the pedal. So that's something you can change depending on what kind of fabric you're trying to make. And then the left side tells the weaver what order to press the petals in to make the specific pattern. So you can make pretty complicated fabrics this way. There's a lot of different things that are possible, but each time you want to change it, you have to reconfigure the loom. So that involves climbing underneath and hooking up the petals a different way.
As you saw, weaving patterns are directly related to code through their binary foundations. Weaving drafts, those gridded patterns that you saw in the previous clip, are essentially programs. As Jakob Jennerholm Hamar writes in Weaving Drafts at the Edge of the Abyss, weaving drafts, or notations, are sets of instructions and visualizations of patterns to guide the setup and operation of a loom in the weaving process. The drafts say little about the materiality of the final weave, its size, structure, shape, texture, or color. Qualities brought forth in the weaving process by the interaction between weaver, yarn, and loom. Even though the pattern is drawn out and explained, there's room for improvisation, intuition, error, and external particularities and influence of all kinds. The drafts carry the history, the traditions, the identity and memories contained within the patterns, as well as reflecting the binary and digital nature of weaving in their fields, grids, and matrices. I love this quote because it shares that while the loom was able to show you the instructions how to create a specific type of garment, there was still a very human element to it about choosing how certain things happen, the thicknesses of the yarns, the textures, the color. I think you see this a lot today in the creative computational sphere, where you can do things very simply and very effectively with code, but you can also do them in a very fun way. Okay, back to weaving. A weaving draft functions a lot like code. If you understand code, let me explain it like this. A weaver follows literal conditions. If I lift shafts 2 and 4 and pass the shuttle, the pattern emerges. This is algorithmic thinking, procedural logic, and binary operation, the writing of code and thread. Now, if you place some early bitmap images next to weaving drafts, they'll look almost identical. Both are grids of binary choices, creating visual output, and both softwares had pixels. Another similarity between textiles and technology. Before we get to my favorite loom, the loom that single-handedly transformed computation forever, it is worth considering just how deeply the language of textile and technology have always been intertwined. The word technology and textile both come from the Greek word techne, meaning craft, art, or skill. Hamar explains that the use of weaving, spinning, and textile fabrication as not only a metaphor, but a way of both understanding and making sense of the world and working with the structure or the fabric of the universe can be traced from ancient times up until today. He references Yu-Sung Lee, author of The Textile Sphere, The Threshold of Everyday Contacts, writing, "With textile understandings through relational approaches, Lee uses the image of the textile sphere as a tool for exploring the complexities of social interaction, displacement, and contemporary spatiality in both physical and virtual spaces, a way of understanding belonging and awareness with textiles as a threshold between material and immaterial, human and non-human." I think this conversation really shows us how interlocked weaving and our lives are. They both rely on each other. You can't separate the two from our evolution. This leads me to one of my favorite topics as a kid, ancient myths. For thousands of years, myths portrayed weaving as links to life itself. I'll be referencing a few Greek myths because at my core I am a Percy Jackson kid, but these myths spanned many cultures across the world. I'd love to do a deeper dive into these other stories if you're interested, just let me know. So you have Arachne, which inspired the spider, sure you know that myth, the 3 fates who would spin and cut this thread of life, and Penelope who would weave and unweave her tapestry every day while she waited for her husband to return. Doing the research for this video essay, I did wonder, was my interest in all of this what led me to textiles? Meryl did know who she was from a very young age, it seems. These metaphorical threads only continue when you talk about digital language. The World Wide Web evokes the spider, our first weaver, Miss Arachne. In Old English, web with 2 B's meant woven fabric, and Webster meant weaver. When we talk about the internet, we use these words that reference textiles almost every day. We speak in conversation threads, email chains, software patches, image warping, and networks. You might be thinking, how did this inexplicable link occur when creating the words that we use for the computers today? It's probably because when you think about humanity's earliest technologies, it's all textiles. I was either watching a TikTok or listening to a podcast or reading an article that stated that the basket was the first technology before the sphere. We were gatherers before we were hunters. And think about it, some of our very basic needs involve the use of technology like the needle and thread to make warm coats in order to survive, to make tents, to create shelter, to gather food. Textiles have always been the technology that innovated us throughout history, and it will continue to be. I am also thinking of writing a further video essay about this link between textiles and language, so please comment below if that is of any interest to you. The history of technology is often told through metal and stone, but textiles, soft, flexible, and largely invisible in archaeological record, were among humanity's first major innovations. Now, why did it take us ages to recognize that we might have created fiber technology before sticks and stones and all of that stuff? Well, because fibers degrade, babes. We thought ceramics came before it, but we've found some proof that it doesn't. The earliest textile technology is cordage, twisting fibers together to use for bowstrings, nets, snares, baskets, bags, slings, clothing, fasteners. This manipulation of linear materials into engineered forms required advanced cognitive abilities, being the connection between the creation of textiles and the innovation of the human species. Pretty sick. Before woven cloth, humans made baskets, mats, nets, fish traps, and other interlaced structures using a system of plaiting, twining, and looping. Nets are among the earliest large-scale technological system. Lightweight, flexible machines powered by geometry. One of humanity's most transformative tools was the sewing needle, dating back about 40 to 50,000 years ago. Needles allowed Homo sapiens during the Ice Age to survive climates and to migrate across Eurasia. They also enabled us to create pouches, containers, tents, shelters, expanding what humans could build and carry. Now that's the beginning of humanity, but we continue throughout times to have very influential moments of textile technology that changed culture and moved us forward. If you think back to your middle school history classes, you might remember how textiles shaped many economies across the world, from linen in Egypt, wool in Mesopotamia, silk in China, and cotton in India and the Americas. Textile work required specialized labor, from spinning to dyeing to weaving, and shaped early cities and trade networks. Think the Silk Road, the British India Trading Company, another great example. So if textiles have always been so influential on our money systems, on our technology, why have they been disregarded for so many years? I bet you know the answer to this. Because they were primarily done by women. Surprise! As E.W. Barber writes in Women's Work, the First 20,000 Years, 2 millennia ago, women were actively engaged in crafting and wearing clothing made from spun fibers. Surprisingly, despite the labor-intensive process of creating fiber in garments, most historical and economic texts lack information on these vital contributions. Descriptions of prehistoric and early historic cultures have overlooked nearly half of the story. Leila Vala, a fashion practitioner from the Netherlands, echoed this statement, noting how textiles were often dismissed in the 1970s as slowness, clumsiness, or folksy feminine art. Indigenous textile technologies, likewise, were dismissed as primitive despite their sophistication. Malvika writes powerfully about this in her article, We Have Computation Because of Weaving, highlighting the Andean Quipu, a three-dimensional, hierarchical, relational database made from knotted cords. I want to read quite a big portion of this article because I find it so impactful, so buckle up. So when speaking about the Quipu, she said, the mathematical precision rivals modern programming languages. The Quipu Mayottes, or the Quipu authorities, could perform arithmetic operations like addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division, functioning as human processors executing computational operations on this fiber-based hardware. What they understood in 3 dimensions, we've flattened into something no less magical. the matrix. These grids of numbers, born from the ancient logic of warp-crossing web, now run your entire digital life. Matrices are deciding whether your face unlocks your phone, which song Spotify plays next, and how your camera makes you look good in terrible lighting. Even the screen you're reading this on is just millions of tiny matrices switching pixels on and off 60 times per second. Quipus were hierarchical and relational, but quipus went beyond mere data storage. They were like early computers, early counting machines. As filmmaker Kim McCrary observes, they function not just as databases, but as multimedia storage systems, encoding stories, myths, and cultural knowledge alongside numerical data, much like how modern systems integrate text, metadata, and relational information. These systems were older than Stonehenge, older than the pyramids, older than written language itself. And the Spanish conquistadors declared them the devil's work and ordered most of them to be destroyed. Of thousands of quipus, only about 1,400 survived. Imagine if 99% of our internet infrastructure was suddenly deleted, leaving only fragments for future archaeologists to decode. Evidence suggests quipus use binary code to record information, making them the literal precursor to the binary systems that power every device that you are reading these words. Yet because these technologies emerged from the global south, from indigenous knowledge systems, from domains later dismissed as craft rather than computation, their significance has been systematically minimized. We are only now beginning to recognize that the most sophisticated information technologies emerged not from isolated innovation, but from patient hands that understood pattern as language, not as code, and thread as memory. First off, stunning, beautiful, oh, incredible. Beautifully said. There is so much more to say about textiles as memory holders, but we'll have to talk about that in a later episode. Now to my favorite loom, the Jacquard loom. In 1804, Joseph Marie Jacquard introduced the punch card loom, a system that changed both textiles and computation forever. Each card represented one row of a pattern. A hole meant raise this thread, and no hole meant leave it down. Hole, no hole. Yes, no, 1, 0. Binary. Punch cards eliminated the grueling task of rethreading and reconfiguring loom pedals for each pattern, making them a lot quicker, as we said earlier was one of the biggest struggles. It also used optical mixing to create the illusion of additional colors despite only using a few, by mixing them through pattern. Now, if you grew up in the early 2000s and you stood a little bit too close to the TV, you might understand this concept a little better, as you could see all of the little RGB dots. Weaving does a very similar thing, except it did it first. Although Jacquard receives the credit for this incredible feat of technology, the underlying mathematics and pattern, sequencing, system, symmetry, and repetition had been developed by, guess who? Women, over many centuries. Have you guys seen that woman who said that her husband stole all of her paintings, and then in court they both had to paint one of the paintings to show who did it first? I wonder if Jacquard did that with the woman weaver, what would happen? Crazy. Okay, enter Charles Babbage on the scene, a mathematician, a philosopher, and an inventor who was fascinated by Jacquard's invention, and even owned a portrait of Jacquard woven on a Jacquard loom. He loved to bring this portrait out at parties and to ask people how they thought it was made. I love history. Anyways, Charles Babbage used this logic behind the Jacquard loom to invent his analytical engine. Next on the scene, and most importantly on the scene, was the wonderful, the incredible Ada Lovelace. Now, I'd like to read a little bit from the book Zeros and Ones by Sadie Plant to give you a picture of who Ada Lovelace was, because she is the most important one in this story, in my opinion, in many people's opinion. In 1833, a teenage girl met a machine which she came to regard as a friend. It was a futuristic device which seemed to have dropped into her world at least a century before its time. Later to be known as Ada Lovelace, she was then Ada Byron, the only child of Annabella, a mathematician who had herself been dubbed Princess of Parallelograms by her husband, Lord Byron. The machine was the difference engine, a calculating system on which the engineer Charles Babbage, as I described, had been working on for many years. Now, essentially, Ada Lovelace became obsessed with this machine and understood its connection to the Jacquard loom. She translated someone's writing on the difference engine and added her own notes to it, and is said to have been the first creator of the footnote and the hyperlink because of it. These notes written by Ada were what inspired Babbage to create the analytical engine. Ada Lovelace famously wrote about it, saying, "The analytical engine weaves algebraic patterns just as the Jacquard loom weaves flowers and leaves." Her notes are considered to be the world's first computer program. She approached computation like a weaver, not like a mathematician. She was the original woman in male fields. I do think most people, when talking about Ada Lovelace, do leave out how much of a spitfire she is. I want to read a direct quote said about her from Zeros and Ones so you can understand how incredible she is and how she is my biggest inspiration in life. Actually, this was written by William Gibson and Bruce Sterling, stating, "A strong-minded woman, much like her mother, eh? Wears green spectacles and writes learned books. She wants to upset the universe and play dice with the hemispheres. Women never know when to stop." I'm obsessed with that. I want to be called that. This book also details that Babbage's mathematical errors and much of his attitudes greatly irritated Ada, and she has said to have refused to endorse him, stating, "I never can or will support you in acting on principles which I consider not only wrong in themselves, but suicidal." Oh, she declared Babbage one of the most impracticable, selfish, and intemperate persons one can have to do with. 2 additional quotes from Ada are, "I do not believe that my father was, or ever could have been, such a poet as I shall be an analyst." She said this on July 1843. And in November of 1844, she said, "I'm a prophetess born into the world, and this conviction fills me with humility, with fear, and trembling." I feel like these were taken straight from my diary. Ending a brief Ada Lovelace fan edit that I just gave to you. There wasn't much when it came to the evolution of computing for a very long time, because unfortunately, Ada was very sick, very chronically ill, a woman after my own heart, and so she passed away at a very young age. Babbage wasn't really that good without her, to be honest. However, about a century later, this guy named Herman Hollerith, whose brother happened to own a Jacquard mill, created the tabulating machine, which was then used in the 1890 census and was able to calculate information a lot faster than it was before. This machine was then bought by a company and became its most well-known product. The company then changed its name to IBM, and is really the birth of computers of today. The tabulating machine did also run on punch cards. Do you see a theme here? IBM continued to sell punch card systems until the 1980s. That's less than 50 years ago. Crazy. When computing shifted from weaving loom to IBM, from craft to laboratory, from feminine space to masculine prestige, women were pushed out of the story. These women with brilliant minds were kept from computational spaces, so they developed on the loom using that as their computer. Let's take the Bauhaus movement for an example. At the Bauhaus, women were welcomed into the school with open arms and were said to be able to study anything, but when the women got there, they were steered almost exclusively into the weaving workshop. Annie Albers, now recognized as one of the most influential textile artists of our time, wanted to study painting, but was funneled into weaving instead. Yet within the weaving studio, she and other women were able to create these incredible mathematic structures and systems that paralleled early computer science. And they ended up being some of the most influential to come out of the Bauhaus movement, and were some of the people that started the debate in the 60s about craft's place in art, which is still something that we talk about to this day. In other domestic spaces around the world, girls learned computation not through a computer, but through samplers, quilting, lace making, knitting, pattern-based practices that required algorithmic reasoning. They were not recognized as being the precursors to programming because they were feminine, but their logic and pattern creations rival that of first-year engineers' experiments in Python. It makes you think, if women were allowed more into these spaces, I feel like we would be living what I thought the future was going to be, like what the Jetsons were living. Put women into positions of power, amen. Despite being left out of the computational spaces, men still needed women for their labor, for the operating, the assembling, and the programming of these computers. Also from Sadie Plant's Zeros and Ones, when computers were vast systems of transistors and valves which needed to be coaxed into action, it was the women who turned them on. When computers became the miniaturized circuits of silicon chips, it was the women who assembled them. When computers were virtually real machines, women wrote the software on which they ran. And when computers was a term applied to flesh and blood workers, the bodies which composed them were female. One of the most powerful examples of this that I'm absolutely obsessed with is the NASA's Apollo program. The Apollo guidance computer used core rope memory that was woven by women. These women were hired by Raytheon from the Lowell Mills, which, if you know me, I am from the state of Massachusetts, so this is literally my culture, my history. They realized that in order for the computer to operate in space, it was going to need to have some sort of memory in order to be able to run all of its processes. So they ran it on a binary system. A wire through a core represented a 1. A wire around a core represented a 0. They also termed this project the LOL project, the Little Old Lady project.
We called it the LOL method, the Little Old Lady method of wiring these cores. Not a very nice, today you couldn't say that.
This work took months and months, but was essentially the first hard drive. So while it was a man that took the first steps on the moon, he couldn't have done it without the work of women. Now, we talked about how weaving inspired the first computers, but what about the other way around? How computers inspired weaving? Because computers are descended from looms, a lot of our digital tools that we've created today are able to be translated for contemporary weaving practices, leading to some really interesting creations. By 1983, the first computerized Jacquard loom emerged, accompanied by sophisticated CAD systems that allowed weavers to visualize structures, simulate repeats, and derive patterns from images. Machines like the TC2, AVL Jacquard, and Stabuli enabled thread-by-thread control and image-based weaving. These inventions allowed for Jacquard weaving to become much more accessible to talented weavers outside of industry spaces. We love open sourcing, we love information and tools to be accessible to all. Long live! Implementing computers back into weaving also allowed us to enable algorithmic design. Many weavers use processing, Python, Rhino, and Touch Designer to generate patterns from randomness, from fractals, cellular automata, environmental data, and mathematical rules. One of my favorite TikTokers, who goes by Daisy Chains, aka Haley Morton, has some great information on weavers who have used these types of algorithmic designs in their work.
Artists to check out that are straddling that line of computation and textiles. Annie Liu is an interdisciplinary artist who has one of my favorite pieces of artwork of all time, and it's called Mind in the Machine. It's a textile piece that was woven using brain waves. And the way that she did this was she spent a long time kind of like a field worker in a textiles factory in China, and she asked garment workers to wear an EEG headset. Then she took all of this data and transposed it to create loose stitches to signify when a worker was feeling calm. This would become more tight when the brain signals were showing signs of stress. So she's playing with this idea of something is handmade, you can usually more legibly see those signs of stress, like a dropped stitch or like slight imperfection. But because of industrialization and the ways that textile work is so mechanized, all of that gets lost. So she's trying to reintroduce it in this textured fabric.
If you think about it, the modern day weaver isn't just a weaver, but she's part coder, part engineer. I would like everyone from my business and engineering university to now give me an apology because I am an engineer. And while we traditionally think of tablecloths and quilts when it comes to textiles, the evolution of computational textiles has really changed that image altogether. It's actually incredible to see how these two spheres have influenced each other, leading to the creation of E-Textiles, which introduced conductive fibers and sensors, antennas, LEDs, and responsive materials. Woven structures now appear in biomedical devices, soft robot, aerospace composites, and shape-changing fabrics, even pH-sensing underwear. And my favorite part of this whole thing, this increase in computational weaving has also led to an increase in looking back at our culture and our histories, especially those of Indigenous weaving and knowledge, to learn those crafts from those dying artisans. Many digital tools have revived an interest in Indigenous weaving, allowing researchers to reverse engineer their techniques, preserve their knowledge, and build intercultural collaborations. I hope this brief, but also very long introduction to the history of textiles and technology has shown you that the caffeine-fueled disruptor that you frequently see in tech spaces and the nostalgic craft girl who's knitting on her Zoom are actually from the same family tree. Both manipulate pattern, tension, structures, and binary relationships. Both are heirs to a tradition that began with thread, not with transistors. Tech bros are simply the newest weavers, though few realize it. When we acknowledge this history, we see craft as a form of engineering and women as foundational technologists. The divide between the tech bro and the crafty girl was never really real. It was just cultural. Trace any piece of binary logic back far enough and you'll find a thread running through centuries, connecting creativity, pattern, memory, and computation. The tech bro and the crafty girl are part of the same woven legacy. One just forgot that the other existed. It's time to weave these worlds back together. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you next week.
This program was made possible by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.